welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by the author of a book that I read in one sitting. And I don't really do that very much these days because I'm in school and I, work and everything. So it really took over my day, and I'm so excited to talk about this. Hello, welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hello, Jen. It is lovely to be here. I'm Charlotte, and I have to say, I can't believe that's one of my bucket list things is someone read my book all in one go. That's just so awesome. I used to do that as a kid. I remember particularly Clive Barker's Thief of Always. It was a Sunday and I had a sheepskin rug in my room and I just sat there and I read and I read and I read. And I was like, oh, I can't believe now that people are reading mine. Anyway, sorry, more professional. Hello, I'm Charlotte Bond. I am an author. I have also been a ghostwriter. I'm currently a podcaster and an editor and a reviewer and a mother and a rainbow leader and all sorts of things. My book, The FIREBORNE Blade, is out in May, and it's about dragons and knights and mages. Oh my. So I'm so pleased you like it, and I hope your listeners will enjoy it as well.
I really think they will. There's so much here to enjoy, and this is going to be one of my questions, but just to hint at it, it does so much so efficiently in such a short amount of time. But before we get too much into the book itself, I was wondering if we could start off with a little bit about your career. You wear many hats, as you have just said. Could you tell us a little bit about how your journey took you to this book?
It's funny you should say that. I do actually have quite a few hats.
Yeah.
So I have written ever since I was little. When I was in primary school, they had something called a prize that they had, and they only ran it in years sort of 5 and 6, which is the top 2 levels. And in year 5, I didn't know anything about it, and I just randomly wrote something, and somebody else got the prize, and I was like, oh, I'm not having that. So the next year, I really put some effort in, and I wrote a really decent story, and I got a prize along with a few other people. So yeah, my mum still got it on the next to the mantelpiece back in our old house. So I've written for ages. It dropped a little bit while I was a lawyer, because I studied law and I qualified as an employment solicitor. The only trouble was I qualified in the middle of a recession, and that was pretty tricky. So when everything crashed and the employment law tribunals used to be free, and then suddenly they went, you know what, we're going to charge money and you have to pay to bring your case. And they were like, yeah, well, we haven't got any money to bring your cases, and nobody had any money to defend the cases. And they suddenly didn't need as many employment lawyers. And I was like, oh. And I was a mother by that point. I was like, I have no clue what I'm going to do. So I'd already written a few books, and I'd been to writing classes as well. So I knew how books work. So I went, you know what? I'm going to be a ghostwriter, because randomly that was something I could do. So I did a load of ghostwriting. I've written YA, cozy mysteries. They're one of my favorite. I do love a good cozy mystery. I wrote some erotica set in ancient Rome. I wrote some children's novels. I did all sorts. I can't tell you which books they are, I'm afraid, because bound by all this kind of NDAs and things. And then after ghostwriting for a while, I was like, you know what? I really like giving the feedback. That's a bit I'm best at. So I did a few more courses and I became an editor. All the while, I'm still writing away in the background, and I got short stories published. I got a few of the novellas. They're mostly horror with small presses. Small presses are a great place for an author to start out. If you're a brand new author, small presses are the ones that take the risks, that take the new people, that are interested in the short and sharp ideas. I won an award for one of my collections. And just as I was reeling from that, I got the offer to have my book published with Tor.com, and that's where I am now.
That's a really fascinating journey, and I'm especially fascinated by the fact that you've written in so many genres. What do you feel like let me rephrase that a little bit. Do you feel like writing in multiple genres gave you a better sense of what genre you felt at home in? You said like you really liked cozy mysteries, and I'm wondering if you also really enjoy the sort of like historical fantasy type space. What did you learn from, writing in so many areas?
I learnt that there were some areas I just didn't want to write. So yeah, it was a really good experience. And the thing about ghostwriting is it's not like a novel writing. So at the moment I'm writing a novel, and I would show you my desk, but it's very, very messy. It's got a pile of books for research. And you don't do that in ghostwriting. They send you some stuff and they're like, I want it in 8 weeks. Or alternatively, I've been working on this for 17 years and I just can't get it right, so I want you to work on it. So it's very different to writing your own book. And I think that what I learned was that there were good and bad ways to do things. And I looked at what some of the ghostwriters are doing. I was like, that's not really me. And I'm happy to write it and I can write it because I read these kind of books or whatever. But on the other hand, this isn't what I want to do. And whilst I was ghostwriting, of course, still writing my own stuff. And yeah, I mean, the trouble with being widely read is you want to put a little bit of everything in your stories. And that's why I quite like fantasy, because you can draw so many elements into it and stuff like that. And I do like ancient history as well, and myths and legends. So that suits me really well. But the ghostwriting was mainly to help me structure a novel and to kind of take what I'd learned and put it into practice. Because although as a writer, you're always learning, and back then I didn't know as much as I know now, but I still know more than for the people I was ghostwriting. So it's all about just working and building, and I provided them feedback. And it was, like I say, it was feedback I enjoyed. So that's why I went on to editing.
Oh, very nice. I know you've done some history in there, you mentioned, and I'm really curious about the role that creating history and lore plays in world building, especially in fantasy world building. So having, with the sort of surreptitious history writing that you've done before for various history outlets, how do you adapt your skills writing about real history to fantasy world building?
So I think you mean the articles I did for the vintage news and things like that. That's, yeah. So that is writing an article like that. You have, say, a morning or an afternoon in which to get it done and get it through. So being able to know where your sources are, to be able to get it and go, right, that's right, that's not right. And just having a general idea and going, actually, do you know what? It says that fact there, but I'm not 100% sure that's right. So I'm going to do a Google search on that particular fact. Oh, look, here's, 7 places that say it's wrong. So it's a very different skill to produce an article within a day, say, to actually put a load of work in. And I mean, I was researching in the evenings and sitting there, my husband's watching the rugby, my daughter's on a Switch, and there's me sitting reading about dragons and medieval times and all this kind of things. And I think when it comes to history, the way I approach it is you narrow it down, you research and you follow every lead, you narrow it down, down, and down, and you go, right, that looks true. I can say that. I don't need to caveat it with, oh, well, some people say, or whatever. That is true. That happened. That's good. We have evidence for it. Or pulling it back a little bit, well, some people say this, some people say that. The evidence suggests, you learn all these clever phrases.
Mm.
In fantasy, it's a little bit different. You narrow it down and down until you just go, stuff it. I'm just going to make it up. Or you already know a piece of history, but you tweak it a little bit. So food is always my favorite thing to do. So I'm a huge baker. I love baking. My mum was a chef, so we grew up with lots of different recipes and things like that. I have my own recipe book that I'm putting together, not like to publish, but I cut out recipes and adjust them. And I added some more cloves, and I took out the raisins and things like that. So you research what historical food is for that era, and then you just tweak it a little bit. You maybe throw in, I know, some random plant that you've made up, something like that. And I mean, I was once talking to an editor and saying about writing history and going, oh my God, you just go down a rabbit hole, and you don't know what you can write, because you're like so petrified someone will email you and go, that's not right. Whereas when it's fancy, he looked both ways and he went, just make it up. And I think there is an element of that. But the other thing I found when writing book 2, by that point, I was very deeply immersed in my world. In writing book 2, I was running out of ideas, and I had to create some artifacts for Madeleine to take with her on a quest. And I was like, I have no idea. And I've researched all my books, and I don't know. I've looked at all the, artifacts that King Henry had. I've looked at, the crown jewels and, stuff from other realms. I just don't know. And so from a point of view, if it was research and it was history, that would actually make it easier, because I go, okay, well, I know what existed, I can have those. Whereas with fantasy, like, well, I know what existed, and now I have to make up something completely different based on what I already know. So making it up has its pros and cons, I think. And I think the key thing is to try and be consistent within your world. Obviously, if it's historical, you have to be consistent within what facts tell you. If it's if it's fantasy, then you've got to be consistent with what you've already said has gone before.
Mm. Since you've already written in this world, do you have like a sort of a lore guide? Do you have like how?
Sorry, Jen's laughing because I'm holding up my book. Oh, wrong way around. So yeah, the first novella was, it was in a cave, basically. And I made up the world and I concentrated on making up the dragons and the knights and the chivalric code and things like that. Then it came to book 2 and she's out of the cave. And I'm like, okay, now I've got to make up a whole world. And I was a bit stuck. And I said to my editor, I'm going to have to buy another notebook, because it's a big joke with writers, oh, well, I've got 17 notebooks, but it's not possibly the right one. And my editor, within 24 hours, had sent me a dragon notebook, and it's so beautiful. And it contains all my research. So it's got a combination of research and lore within it. So it's got pages where I've just written down notes about dragons, and then it's got things headed like death customs, food, landscape, stuff like that. And so it's all within that book and I refer back to it. And it also means that when I go back to edit book 1, I'm like, okay, what did I make up for book 2? Make sure it corresponds with that. And then any later books I might get written, I can go back and go, oh God, what did my landscape look like? And what custom is it in the 13th realm and things like this.
Wow. That really makes me think that you have to go beyond even being a historian of your own world. You're also an anthropologist and a geographer and a
Yes.
geologist. Like you really have to be interdisciplinary about it.
I think there is a certain element of that. And I mean, that's the bit I enjoy. I think if I could just make up worlds and not have to write the books and get paid for it, and just, hand in a notebook and go, look what I did. And then someone will be, yeah, brilliant, we have some money. But unfortunately, after doing all the fun bit, you then have to sit down and make characters and write books and then try and make it all come together.
So you mentioned dragons before, and I am particularly interested in dragons just because they have such a rich history and they come from so many different cultures that have their own traditions. And they function, I think, in so many different ways in fantasy, in like our contemporary fantasy setting. So could you talk a little bit about what sort of dragon research you may have done and what you did to make them your own?
Well, it's back to this idea of history research, isn't it? And you narrow it down and down and down. The thing about dragons is they didn't exist. So it's a bit of a fine line. The books I read were like, well, here we have, ancient scrolls from Pliny the Elder was my favorite one. And apparently Pliny the Elder wrote dragons eat elephants. And that's made it into my second book. The elephants don't get eaten, don't worry. The elephants, well, I can't give away any spoilers. But yeah, and I was like, well, I'm incorporating that. But it was weird because Pliny wrote that. It's like, oh yeah, dragons eat elephants. That's totally what they do. And then all the way through history, you have other like monks who are writing the history of the British Isles. Oh, and the dragons that ate the elephants. And it's like, no, that's what, how is it, it's just fascinating to see it trickle through. So I read various books that described other dragons, and it was very important to me not to nick any other dragons. So I read British Dragons by Jacqueline Simpson. I read for the look of them, because that was the other thing. They had to be quite distinctive. Dracopedia, which is like a book with lots of different artist illustrations in it, and it was gorgeous. Oh, they were so wonderful. And I go through and go, oh, I like that. Oh, I like that. Oh, I'm going to have this. Oh, but I've already got one of those on the other dragons. Because the publisher asked me to do some descriptions of dragons for the Dragon Stat cards. I don't know if you've seen them. They're out in the world at the moment. They're on Twitter and everything. They're gorgeous. And little illustrations in the books as well. I was like, oh my goodness, I've got illustrations. So I actually had to genuinely narrow it down and go, this dragon looks like this and this dragon looks like that. But beyond that, I then also had to think of wider things. So it's like, well, how do my dragons fit into the world? And one of the things I really struggled with is they're an apex predator. There ain't nothing that's going to get a dragon, apart from a knight, obviously. So I was like, well, if you're an apex predator, are you going to live in a wasteland? Are you just going to not, is it going to be nothing for miles? And I was like, well, I don't want that, because I want my dragons to interact with humanity. That was quite important for the world I was setting it in and the cultures of dragons and humans as well. But they couldn't just decimate. So in the end, I decided that my dragons, they do eat food, but they also live on words, and that doesn't come out till book 2. And they gain nourishment through words. So they'd curl up on the top of the town hall and listen to wedding ceremonies inside and drink in the words and gain nourishment like that. And I was like, that was a wonderful idea, and it's totally obviously creative and wonderful, but also by the fact that I needed some way that they could feed without eating all the sheep within a 3-mile radius. They also sleep for a decent amount of time, so they're not always an ever-present threat. Because obviously, you think about modern day, if you've got like a rat infestation, you call the council immediately. Or if there's something, if there's I don't know, there's a puma running around from a local zoo, you call in the zoo to come and get it. You don't just live with it. And it was same with wolf hunters in the old days and things. So I didn't want it to be that the dragons were always plaguing them. So that was something else I had to think about. But the other one I quite liked was there are elder dragons who are like the White Lady, and then there are lesser dragons. And the idea is that they've evolved to be like the species around them. So I've got a dragon that's like an eel because it's evolved in a marsh, and some that are like birds. So I did a short story, and there's one that's like a peacock, and ones that are like cats, and ones that are like dogs, or ones that are like bears. And I was just like, and they fit in and they kind of slot into. It's almost like camouflage, so they slot into the area. So the bear dragon will, happily eat honey, and the cat dragon will chase mice and things like that. So that was again a need of thinking about how it fit into the environment and created this cute little idea. So I'm just like, oh, because everybody, I don't know if you've seen the cover reveal for the second book, but there's a dragon cat in it, and that's not how I imagine my dragons, but I thought like a long, cuddly, furry dragon that chases mice is maybe smaller than your elder dragons. And I just thought that was such a cute idea. And it's something I haven't seen done before, this idea of sort of not crossbreeding. I don't suggest that my dragons mated with cats, just they sort of took on, a bit like osmosis, took on the attributes of them so they could fit within the food chain and things.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I was so taken with the sort of like they're savoring words, I even thought of, this is you can see my sort of failed medieval historian background here, but it made me think of how in Beowulf they talk about word hoards, and like we know that dragons love to hoard things, so why wouldn't they also hoard words, and I love that so much. And I do love that it's sort of it like all their different varieties does suggest a sort of like long process of evolution and accommodation. And it's a really lovely, like lived in world.
Well, it's funny you should mention Beowulf, because when I came to do dragons in the later book, I was like, well, how do dragons speak? Because they're a whole separate species. And I decided that they were going to have kennings. So, kennings are like where you take you take one word and you make it into two distinctive words. It's from all the Beowulf epics, and it's like a ship is a water horse, and a king is a gift giver and things like that. So yeah, so in book 2, all my dragons speak in kennings, and I had great fun making up all these random. And what did I have? Ground Cloud is a sheep. And I nicked one from Beowulf, which was Heather Stepper, which is a deer. And I think Hairy Squealers are pigs and things like that. And I can't remember them all now. That is a big long list somewhere. I felt really sorry for my copy editor to go through and figure out what they all were. So it's interesting you should say about Beowulf, because again, that was a bit more of an inspiration, because I'd read about that and it was in my mind when I was drawing my dragons. I'm like, kennings, there we are, brilliant.
Yeah, I really love that. Gosh, so since we're talking about the medieval, let's talk about your approach to medievalism and balancing sort of authentic sort of medieval world building with the fantasy elements and the bits of medieval history that appeal to modern audiences and worldviews. So like when you were writing this world, do you find yourself mixing the unfamiliar with the familiar? Like, do you make accommodations to a modernist viewpoint to explain this world? I feel like I'm not phrasing this question particularly well, but what is your approach to popular medievalism, I guess, and portraying the sort of medieval fantasy?
Well, if you think about the way you come into reading a fantasy book, particularly if you're someone like me who's grown up on it, you have an awful lot of assumptions already. And when I got this question of yours, I thought about how to explain it. And I don't know if you read Terry Pratchett at all. Yeah, there we go. There's a bit where they talk about Moist von Lipwig in Making Money, I think it is, where he's talking about forgery. And he says, you know what? If you do something too well, people will spot the differences and they'll go, hey, that looks more real than the original. Whereas just the gentle brush of a pen, a suggested line, they'll just encourage them to fill in the blanks and they will see what is not there. And I think it's something similar when you write fantasy, that you've already got this preconceived fantasy idea in your head. And a good example of this was when I was thinking about the clothes. If I spent the whole time describing all of the different clothes and whatever, we'd be there forever. And it's one of my flaws that I don't always describe what people are wearing or what they look like, because it just takes, how do you slot it in genuinely, unless they're standing at a mirror admiring their clothes? How do you put it in a way that works well? So the way I've learned to deal with that is I try and put in little bits where they maybe look at their shoes, or they're taking off their armor or something like that. But obviously, when it's fantasy, you don't know what people are wearing. People automatically roughly know what a squire is going to wear, what a knight is going to wear. So I didn't, for example, describe their shoes because they're not going to be wearing Crocs. They're not going to be wearing DMs. People will just assume it's shoes, it's fine. But I did the little details and things like that. So I think when it comes to balancing it, history and medievalism, we already have an idea in our heads. And it's when you come down to the nitty gritty bits that you really need to think about it and describe it carefully. But you can almost use shortcuts, and too much detail will just make it dull. So you figure out what the reader would focus on, what your characters would focus on in that particular situation, what your readers would focus on, and just put that little bit in and don't be tempted to overdo it. Whether I make any sort of concessions to modern world, I don't know that I do, except perhaps in attitude. So I know one of the things that's being said a lot about my book is it's was it come for the slaying of the dragon, stay for the slaying of the patriarchy. So one of the things I wanted to do with the book was to kind of look at the world of knights and how we imagine it from like the Knight's Tale. I got to watch A Knight's Tale just for, research. I watched Dragonheart as well, the one with Sean Connery as the dragon, because that helped me visualize how big a dragon would be, how it would walk next to someone, how it would move. I didn't like the way his lips move. That's why they speak telepathically, because I was like, I'm not just having my dragon's lips. It just looks weird. But yeah, so I had a look at all those things and the modern stuff. And I was like, I want to have a modern sheen to it, but not do it over the top. So the fact that Madeleine is trying to overcome the prejudices of her being a woman are kind of secondary to the actual action, but it's in there. And I think from what I've heard that it works quite well. Readers seem to be quite happy to have that as a reasoning and as a sort of a sheen over the top, but they wouldn't necessarily want to hear her, going into a big fight with the king about how she shouldn't be kicked out, or, the bits in with all the jousting at the beginning where she gets kicked out. It's probably not very interesting, where it's just a load of men having a go at her. Some men go, oh, it's fine, you're one of the boys, don't worry, we'll look after your kid, kind of thing. That's not really what I wanted to do, but I did want it in there. So I think for me, it was kind of a balance of, okay, let's have this overarching idea, but let's make the action all about dragons and knights and things that will kill you in the dark.
I remember reading, I forget who wrote it, but they were comparing different approaches to fantasy world building. And one was a sort of maximalist approach, where everything that you create kind of ends up on the page. And the other was a sort of minimalist iceberg approach, where you get glimpses of that world. And then like the reader's imagination lets you fill in all the blanks and stuff like that. So I'm, really interested in sort of how you use, like so these minimalist hints to sort of suggest a historical time period. That's really, really interesting.
Well, I think one of the things I've learned from reading the reviews of the books is that everybody takes different things away from the same book. Some people will love one element, some people hate it. Some people, like you, have said it was brilliant. I read it in an afternoon. It was great. Other people went, oh my God, it's too short. What's the point of this novel? It's like, everybody has different expectations from a book. I mean, personally, I started to read American Psycho a couple of months back. And I couldn't get on with it. It was so detailed down to the type of hair, shampoo, and his detailed skincare routine. And I was like, I can see why the author has done this, and I can see why it appeals to me, but it's just not me. And I watched the film a month or so ago when it was on at Christmas. Oh my goodness, sorry, I said a month ago in April. I meant when it was on at Christmas, I recorded it, and then I watched it a month ago. Also, it doesn't feel like we're in April. It feels like it's still just Christmas around the corner. And it worked really well in the TV and movie setting. This whole detail, because you could focus in on things like that. But personally, that's not what I like when I'm reading. I much prefer things that tick over a lot quicker, but focus and have little bits. I'm quite a big fan of Stephen King in the horror, and his brilliance is that he knows when to focus in on the people, on the details, and he knows when to have a wider aspect. And I like to think that's kind of influenced my own writing a little bit. But again, there is nothing wrong with incredibly detailed, and that's what some people definitely go into books for, and they absolutely love. And it would be boring if all books were the same.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And just as there are different ways of writing history too, like you can read a 1,000-page volume about 2 years in a country, or a slim volume that covers an entire historical period. So my last question is about writing in a series. I think when I wrote the question out to you, I erroneously said first. But when you are writing an installment in a series, how do you balance the narrative needs of that volume with the larger arc that you are going for in a serialized story? Like, how do you balance the need for a satisfied ending or what have you, with the sort of like the bits that need to remain unresolved to bring you into the next story, if that makes sense?
No, absolutely. I mean, I probably haven't got the best answer to this because I wrote the book as a book. There wasn't supposed to be any more. That has always been my way of doing it. Ever since I started submitting, I write a book written complete and I say, but there is the possibility of later because it will depend on the publisher. You might get a publisher that wants 17 books, you might get a publisher who wants 1 book or someone who wants a trilogy. So I think one of the keys to being a good writer is being flexible enough to be able to expand or contract as you need to. I did an interview with Peter V. Brett recently, and he's a very different type of writer. And obviously, he's been writing for years. And he was saying that his first book was planned to be a 5-book series, and the publishers were like, "Well, we'll take 3." And he's like, "Okay, but it's a 5-book series." They said, "Well, we'll see when it gets to sort of book 3 how we're doing." And of course, phenomenally successful. And they're like, "We want another 3 books," and he's like, "It's a 5-book series. I will write you another 2 and then a different book." So he obviously had a really clear idea of where the story was going, and I'm massively impressed by anybody who can do that. But for me, I found the best way to work is to have an idea for a book and then leave myself loopholes. So I did have an idea of where it was going to go. But because it was a written book, it had a beginning, a middle, and end. It had character development in it, not much because it's a novella and you don't have a lot of words to play with. And I had more fun playing with the dragons than necessarily playing with the characters. But it was because it sort of follows the story arc idea, the story arc structure, and it has what it's called dark before the dawn. The idea of it gets really, really desperate just before they triumph. Again, I think that helps make a satisfying ending if you put your characters in so much peril and then get them out of it in a satisfying way. The original, it started out as a short story, this novella actually, and it had a really depressing ending. But when I turned it into a longer story, and I started spending more time with my characters, I'm like, oh, I can't do that to them. So I was like, how can I make it a better ending and one that is satisfying and whatever? And actually, as I extended it, it almost wrote the sequels itself. So the dragons became more interesting to me, and the theory of how the dragons view the humans, how the humans view the dragons, how it used to be, the history behind it. Because obviously I'm writing in a snapshot of time. And although I've got excerpts from books, The Demise and Destiny of Dragons, which detail previous dealings between knights and dragons. Well, how did it get to that point? If these dragons are smart and can talk, what was their culture like before? Which wasn't really something I'd really thought about when I'd first written it, just as a short story. But as I expanded it out, it was more interest. So I made a few notes as I was going along. And I thought, well, if this only stays in my head, it's not a problem. But then obviously Tor wants some more books. So I was like, brilliant. So I've got, I can add in a few extra bits. And I mean, the character of Hosh at the very end, as I was writing his death, I was like, you know what? This guy ain't going down without a fight. And once he's down, I don't trust him to stay down. And just the character himself made me think, and the background to him, as it becomes clear at the beginning of book 2, the background to him just suggested he was not a character that was going to, let what happened to him happen without some consequences. So the sequels almost wrote itself because of what I included. And then, like I say, this when I was writing book 2, I did go back and put a few little bits in. So there's more religion in book 2 because they're out and about and talking to people. And Madeleine goes on a trip to the underworld, so I had to write a whole underworld thing. And while I was thinking about that and gods and things, I went back and put in a few bits in the book 1. So I was quite lucky that they came out together, because obviously if it had been book 1 and it had been really huge and then they said, could we have some more, I'd have been, oh, I've not left enough space. But because I know in advance, I can do it.
So we've been talking about the next books in this series, and without spoiling anything, you've already told us a little bit about what's in store. Is there a when we can find out what happens later in this story, or like where are we in the process?
Oh, well, so where are we in the process? So I've got the cover for the Bloodless Princess. The cover is always my favorite bit. So that's all out in the world. And yeah, just going through the final stages. But it's been the Bloodless Princess, which is book 2, has been written for quite a while. And it's just going through the last little bits and pieces. And that's out, it's actually out in October, 28th of October, and I'm a huge Halloween fan. And I'm like, oh, my book's being released in Halloween, so I'm super excited. And it's a lot, is it darker? There's fewer deaths in book 2, but because they go into the underworld, there's a lot more dead people, if that makes sense. And I think whereas everyone was they've called the first one sort of very Dungeons and Dragons-y, and it's very questy and it feels very familiar. I was trying to do something a little bit different with book 2. It's always tricky doing a sequel, going, well, I want to do more of the same because that's what people want. But on the other hand, it's got to be different enough to keep people's interest. And I really enjoyed creating Madeleine and Saraline's next stage of their relationship. And it's a happy relationship. I'm not very keen on these like love triangles and longing looks that go on for 7 books and things like that. So I'm like, no, this is going to develop in a nice way, and it's going to have a happy resolution, because I write horror and dark fantasy, but I'm such a softie when it comes to some of my characters. I don't like killing them off or giving them unhappy endings. And I really enjoyed writing about the dragon as well. So the White Lady, who is seen in book 2, becomes a major character in the White Lady who's seen at the end of book 1 becomes a major character in book 2, and he's the little dragon cat on the front of the book cover. And I had great fun writing about her, and she got some good lines. I imagine when I was speaking to my audiobook narrator and we were talking about all the different characters, like we were talking about the White Lady, and I was like, I imagine her like Maggie Smith, so Professor McGonagall, or a character from Downton Abbey, something like that. She's kind of got this wryness to her, and she's really powerful and really important and really knowledgeable and quite old and very authoritative, but also a bit cheeky, and will give you a bit of a nudge and whatever. So I enjoyed writing some of the humor into book 2 that I didn't get a chance. We're very serious in book 1. So it was a little bit more lighthearted and a little bit silly. So it's good fun in book 2. I hope. You can never be sure about these books until they start going out to people. And like I say, the response to the FIREBORNE Blade has been fantastic. So I'm just hoping that book 2 and the Bloodless Princess will be equally well received. But we shall see. At least I got to write about dragon cats.
I'm so excited for Dragon Cats. I'm so excited to see more of the White Lady. And, thank you for coming to talk to our show. It's been really lovely talking to you and finding out more about your process. And if you want to come back to talk about book 2 someday,
I would love to. I want to talk about underworlds and all the stories I learned about. Oh, and I didn't get a chance to tell you about the farting dragons that I discovered in my research as well. I'll come back and tell you about the farting dragons for book 2. There's a promise.
Making a note in my calendar to ask you in October or whenever about farting dragons. So
Awesome.
All right, listeners, now it's your turn. You're going to check out the FIREBORNE Blade. It is so much fun, so beautiful. So head to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for books. When you hear this, it will be out in the world, so go check it out. Thank you for joining us, listeners, and Charlotte, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This has been so much fun. I definitely look forward to coming back.
It's been a pleasure. All right, thank you. It's now time to close this chapter. Bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.